For Part 2 of your key assessment, you are going to give your case study student an assessment called the Phonological Awareness Screening Test, or PAST for short. The version you are using is called Form A, and there are other versions of the assessment, like Form B, Form C, and so on, that you would give students throughout the school year. The version of PAST that you are using in our class was revised in 2024, so you are using the most recent one. Before you administer the PAST, there is a set of guidelines that you should read. Although the guidelines are lengthy, it is recommended that you read them at least twice so you are familiar with them. However, we're going to discuss some highlights of the PAST here. When you ask a question on the PAST and a student responds, you are supposed to count so you can determine if the student is automatic. You count like this: 1001, 1002, and so on. A student is considered automatic if they give the correct answer before you say 2. If a student gives you a correct and automatic answer, you score their answer on the PAST with an X. That might feel counterintuitive because usually we mark an X for something incorrect. However, you can use your own scoring system as long as you understand it and you are consistent. For example, you might give a check mark instead of an X when scoring a correct automatic response from your student. A student is scored with a 1 if they give you a correct answer but they are not automatic, meaning they give you the answer after you have counted 1001, 1002. You give a student a score of 0 on an assessment item if they give you an incorrect answer. Another thing that you should know about the PAST is that if a student gives you an incorrect response, you provide them with corrective feedback every time they are incorrect. The feedback you should give is provided on the assessment. For example, in Level D, you will give students the following prompt for the first item on line D1. Say bookcase. Now say bookcase, but don't say book. If the student doesn't say case and is incorrect, you would give them this feedback. If you say bookcase without saying book, you get case. As another example, the first item on line D2 uses the following prompt. Say silver. Now say silver, but don't say sil. The student should say ver, but if they don't, your feedback would be, if you say silver without saying sil, you get ver. You would use the same structure for giving feedback for any other items missed in Section D. Each section of the PAST includes a sample feedback phrase for incorrect responses. Much of the time, you are not going to give a student the entire PAST assessment. Look at the syllable levels section of the assessment, which are levels D and E. If the student gets the first item on the line correct and their response is automatic, you do not have to ask them to respond to the next 2 items on the line. For example, if they correctly and automatically say bookcase without book for the first item on line D1, you do not have to ask them to say sunset without sun and spaceship without ship. You can skip ahead to the first item on line D2. You can mark all items on line D1 as automatic and correct. However, you should be aware that if you are assessing a child in kindergarten, you should ask them to respond to all items in levels D and E. You can skip items if your student is in first grade or higher. If a student gets the first item on the line correct but their response is not automatic, you should ask them to say the next 2 items on the line. This applies for D1, D2, E2, and E3. When you move on to the next part of the PAST, the initial phoneme onset rhyme levels, or levels F and G, you'll see there are 5 items in both level F and level G. If the student automatically and correctly reads the first 3 items in level F and level G, you can skip the remaining 2 items and mark them correct. If any of the first 3 items in levels F and G are incorrect or not automatic, give the student all 5 items in each level. When you get to level H and above on the assessment, you will not skip any items, but there is a discontinue rule. If you look at 2 levels in a row and the student's combined correct score on these 2 levels is between 0 and 3 out of 10, you should discontinue the assessment. For example, if a student scores a 2 on level H and a 1 on level I, stop giving the assessment. However, there is an exception. If a student scores a 3 on one level and a 0 on the next level, you can keep going until you meet the discontinue rule criteria. For example, if a student scores a 3 on level H but a 0 on level I, you can continue testing to see how they perform on level J. All items that you do not administer on the PAST after discontinuing should be marked as incorrect. When you follow the discontinue rule, you only need to consider whether answers are correct, not both correct and automatic. Also, if you notice that your student is becoming frustrated and upset, you may decide to discontinue the assessment. This is a judgment call on your part as the teacher. In the event that your student is becoming frustrated or anxious and you have to stop, make a note of where you stopped on the past assessment and make sure you mention this when writing your key assessment narrative.